We are thrilled at the response to this webinar. We have had over 770 people register for this event, which is by far the largest we have ever had. And those folks are from 85 different counties and the Division of Social Services. So huge response. And we want to say a huge thank you. Of course, I'm going to introduce our presenters, who many of you know, Holly McNeill and Dee Hunt, part of the fabulous staff development team at the Division of Social Services. But I also want to say thanks to many of you who suggested this topic for a webinar. It's clearly of huge interest to folks across the state. We also had some really great help from some key folks. We consulted with Angie Stevenson from the Attorney General's Office, with Teresa Strom from the Division's policy team, with Cindy O'Brien from the Division's QCR review team, and with other folks from staff development and at the Division of Social Services. So we are grateful to everybody who helped pull this event together, and to all of you for being with us. I do want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, and you will be able to access it pretty soon on NCSW Learn. There's a webinars page, and you can access many of the recordings of the webinars, and as well as the handouts for today's event. And if there is any sort of follow-up document from the event, that will be posted as well. So that will be there for you and for others from your agency who may not be able to join us this morning. So one final chance, if you have not had a chance to download the handouts, you can click on that link on the slide. We will be referring to them today throughout the event. So let's go ahead and get started. So, you know, we often say with our webinars that in general our goal is that we can present the webinar in the morning and you can use the information in the afternoon. And so for today, I think it really is in that spirit. Our two goals are to describe and practice some key suggestions for creating court-ready documentation. We know that the courts are one of the primary audiences for what you document about your work. And we also know that if your documentation reaches a standard that is good for court, it's going to meet the standards for just about anybody else, any other reviewers or monitors or family members or other professionals who are reviewing your documentation. So we're really focusing on what helps you get ready for court, because that will really help with any audience that is reviewing your records. We also want to talk this morning about the role that agencies and supervisors need to play in supporting good documentation, because we know that, you know, the ultimate goal is that how you document your efforts can improve decision-making and outcomes for children. So, you know, documentation can be tedious and can be challenging, but it also plays a really big role in how children and families do within our system. So we're really glad to have you all here with us and to have our presenters. And we do hope, please continue to use that chat box and send us your questions, your examples, because we know, like with all training, you know, the more you participate and the more we hear from you, the better it will be. So just quickly, our agenda today, I'm going to do a quick orientation and introductions. Then, as I mentioned, we'll talk about some key suggestions for court-ready documentation and talk about the role of agencies and supervisors. And we then have a couple of case scenarios just to be able to quickly practice and apply what we're talking about today. And as you have questions, please feel free to send them. We'll pause a few times to sort of formally answer questions, but feel free to send them at any time. Most of you have already found this. You can type in the chat box. You are able to send chats privately to the host, or you can just chat to everyone. We have two folks online with us today to help with your technical questions. So please feel free to send those, as I see some of you have done, if you've had any problems. Our technical support folks will probably chat back to you privately. So you may see down at the bottom of that box, a little extra yellow box will come up that will probably say hosts. And that means they're trying to send you a private chat. So just if you have any trouble, just keep your eyes open for a little special private message from the hosts because they may be trying to help you. We do also have these little icons which we might ask you to use. Some of those, some of you may be familiar with these, but just in case you're not, up at the top of the screen, you can see a little waving man. So I think of him on the far right side, and there's a little drop-down menu there, and that will let you, we might ask you sometimes to raise your hand or you know, give us a little sign to let us know that you're hearing us, or that you're with us, or that you're ready to move on. So we have fabulous presenters today. As I said, many of you know Dee Hunt and Holly McNeill. They are both program consultants and trainers for the North Carolina Division of Social Services, and we are really excited to have them with us this morning. We also have actually 3 people on today for your help with technical issues: John McMahon, Philip Armfield, and Matt Tarpley. So thanks to all of them. We will be tracking your questions. So don't worry if we don't answer your question right away. We are capturing them, and John is helping us keep track of them so we know that they're there, and we will pause and try to get to them. If for some reason we are not able to get to all of the questions during the event, we will send out a follow-up document, a follow-up Q&A document. So please do be patient. Since we have such a large group this morning, we're going to do our very best to get to all of your questions. But again, if we don't, hang with us and we will try to get those answers for you in writing after the event. So we'd also like to get a sense of who is with us this morning. We know that a number of folks are participating in a group. So I'm just going to ask if you could quickly let us know, are you logged on individually or are you logged on as part of a group? And I'm just going to give you a few seconds. Now, we know if you're part of a group, there's probably just one person voting for you, and so we know you represent more people. And we love when people participate as a group, I think especially for this topic, because a lot of it does have to do with agencies and teams and supervisors and how folks are being supported. So it looks like, since you know, over a third of the logons are a group, we will sometimes, when we ask a question, we'll try to give a few extra minutes for those of you who are in a group to talk about it together and to decide on a response. So I'll ask those of you who are on by yourself to just be patient if you would. We might sometimes take an extra minute or two, because we have heard when people are participating in webinars as a group, sometimes they miss what's being said because they're talking in the room. So we want to try to accommodate that and give you all a chance to talk with each other in the room. So thank you. That is really helpful for us to see that and to know that we have a good chunk of people in groups. So let me just move that. So just a word about why we are doing this webinar. The first thing is that you asked for it. As many of you may remember, we did a survey on behalf of the Division of Social Services earlier this fiscal year, and documentation was the top choice for topics for supervisors and program managers. It's also, of course, part of North Carolina law and policy, and you'll hear a little bit more about that today. And, you know, most importantly, as I mentioned earlier, it's really key to helping us make good decisions. We know that in almost every case, there's more than one person involved in helping a family and making decisions for a family. And so documentation is key to making good decisions and promoting outcomes for kids. So we know this is why it's kind of frustrating and yet near and dear to everyone's heart. So we also know that documentation is an issue no matter what service area you work in. Intake, assessments, in-home, placement, licensing, adoption. You know, sometimes we do topics that are really more relevant to one group or another, but this really is a topic that crosses service areas, and I think that's partly why we have such broad interest. We just want to also remind you, of course, you know that all of the forms and documentation tools are available to you on the division's forms page. We have the link here for you, and of course, Holly and Dee will talk about some of those specific forms this morning. So with that, let me turn it over to Holly to get us started with some suggestions for court-ready documentation.
Good morning, everybody. We're going to talk a little bit about getting your documentation in good shape for court. And I think what's interesting about this is when if your documentation is in good shape for court, it's likely to be pretty family-centered too. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through this. So one of the things that we want to think about when we go to court, most of you know that I do all of the legal aspects training, and I come up against a whole bunch of workers that are nervous about testifying, especially about being cross-examined. And so I try to talk to them about how their documentation can help them in not putting them in a situation that can make cross-examination worse for them. So some of the ways that you can do this with your documentation is to stay away from opinions. Now, I always ask the question, what does not belong in your documentation? And they all say with one beautiful voice, opinions. Which is lovely, and the opinions sneak in there and we don't always recognize them. This quote is a great example. The parent's not concerned about safety. That may not seem like an opinion. It may just seem like an observation. It's not. Unless you can get inside the head of the parent and know for sure that they are not concerned about safety, it's an opinion. We don't know that the parent is not it may not be that they're not concerned about safety. It may be that they are that they're thinking about other things, that they're worried about their sick mother, that they're worried about putting food on the table. And those are exactly the kinds of things that a good defense attorney is going to ask you. Have you never been concerned about a sick relative or something like that and had your attention drawn away from your child? Has that never happened to you? Things like that. So we want to stay away from those things that are that we're assuming. So instead, what we want to write is what we see, what we hear. It creates a video of what we see and what we hear. Also, of course, vague and generic descriptions. We talk about this a lot. The parent is non-compliant. Again, what does that mean, non-compliant? Are they being non-compliant, or are they did they just not understand the instructions? Are they just not doing something because maybe they're not being non-compliant? Maybe they told you they weren't going to do it and they're just not doing it because they never agreed to do it. That may be different than non-compliant. So we want to stay away from those words that are judgment. And again, that goes back to this has that dual role of making it good for court as well as being family-centered and not labeling things as bad when it may not be that they're being non-compliant. There may be some other reason behind it. Of course, we always want to stay away from acronyms and jargon. That just confuses folks. Sometimes it may be things that another social worker coming behind us will understand, and other times certain social workers, certain teams, certain agencies have their own little shorthand. So if you've got somebody coming behind you that has to read that record, they may or may not know your shorthand. I can speak to this just coming from another state. I know when I moved to North Carolina and picking up records and reading them, I was like, what is an LTP? Which was one of the ones that I can remember reading in records, and somebody said, it's a long-term partner. And I was like, Oh, well, I never heard of one of those before. So I just trying to stay away from some of those things, and you know, we do use them sometimes, but making sure that at least, at the very least, that they are written out at least once in the beginning so that people can refer back to it and know what they are, but trying to stay away from those as much as we can. And then watching the use of boilerplate language. And again, not to say that we can never, ever use this kind of language, but trying to limit it as much as we can. And the word appropriately, I think if you all go in and count the times that you use the word appropriate or inappropriate, you would be shocked, or maybe you wouldn't be, I don't know, but we use it so much, and it is completely subjective. What's appropriate to one person is different from what's appropriate to another, so it really doesn't describe anything. So we want to, again, we want to go back to that video description. Again, this sentence that we have there, I think, is a good example. We're seeing this a lot in records. The child is dressed appropriately. And I'm not sure where this one came from, but we see this one a lot. It seems important to workers that they get this in there. And for me, I'm not sure that it's necessary to always address how the child is dressed unless that was a real issue to the case, or if there's a concern about the child's dress, so that, you know, if the child's dress was not a concern on the case and they look fine on that day, because I don't need to read every time you go and see them, the child had on clean clothes and was dressed in shorts, which is appropriate for summer weather, because that's what I would need to know to understand that it's appropriate every time. I don't know that that's something that we need to know every time. When we're writing documentation, we want to address the things that go to safety, that go to risk, and go to progress on the service agreement. So we want to think about those things and think about, is what we're writing going to one of those things? Of course, and the house was clean is one of those that we hear about all the time. And I think we're doing a lot better on some of those about the house is clean. We're doing better about describing that. Okay. And again, be specific instead. So when you find yourself writing, child was dressed appropriately, or mom, mom seems to love her children, which is another one of those kind of vague, generic statements that we use sometimes. Instead of writing that, stop and say, what made me think the child was dressed appropriately? Or what made me think mom loved her children? And write that. What did you see that made you go, huh, looks like mom loves this child? Was it because when the child cried, she went straight to mom and mom quickly picked her up and was able to calm her down quickly? Was it because as soon as mom came into the room, the child's eyes lit up and mom was happy to see her? What was it that made you think that? It may be a few extra words, but it's going to be much harder for a defense attorney to argue with you about. And it's going to be much more meaningful down the road if somebody else has to read your record. We want to get conversations in there. We want to get quotes in there. And any observations, again, create that video of what you see, both actions as well as the environment and what the house looks like, the interactions that you see between family members, things like that. You want to be specific about the safety and risk factors. When you are doing your safety and risk forms, there should be something in the file, whether it's in the on the safety and risk the forms or in your narrative, that it clearly says why you said yes to a safety factor or why you scored something as a risk issue. So you want to make sure that those things are covered, that somebody would be able to look at your record and understand, here's why this was scored as a safety issue, and that should be something that was said, something that was observed, not just a feeling or something like that. It should be something concrete that you can base it on. Again, that is going to help you on the stand when they say, so tell me why this was scored this way. You're going to have that there. And again, we're going to just remind you to avoid that boilerplate. When we start using boilerplate, and it's an easy thing to do because we feel like it helps us to get the words in there we need. But when we start using it, we stop thinking because we just write the same thing every time. And when we stop thinking is when we miss things. Boilerplate, while I'm not saying never use boilerplate, I think we want to make sure that we limit that. Our documentation should be specific to each case. Again, we want to focus on behavior. So we want to hear exactly what the family members are saying and doing, what they're not doing that needs to be done to ensure the safety and meet the goals. We want to help the court understand why you made your decisions and recommendations. So you want them, we don't want to do that in a way that just is defending ourselves. We want to paint a picture that will help them come to that conclusion on their own by letting them see what we saw, hear what we heard. So getting that down on paper and letting them come to that conclusion on their own. Okay. And I think we've covered this pretty much as we talked through the other things. Again, thinking about if there was a video camera, what did you see? And this is something that you just really have to practice and think about, just those dynamics between the family and really getting those action words on there and thinking about that in that way. Sticking to what's relevant. Dee's going to talk a little bit about, in a minute, about the role of the supervisor in this. And I don't think there's any way to for us to help you figure out what's relevant, except to say that this is going to be the crux of this, is to have your supervisor give you feedback about what's relevant and what isn't, because that's the hardest thing to learn, I think, is just to find that balance between what's enough and what's too much. And it's going to be different depending on each case. So you'll hear more about that in just a few minutes. Okay. And do we have time to practice?
Yeah, we do. Okay. And I was going to also say, Holly, maybe you can talk just to think about when you mentioned staying to what's relevant. Could you say a little bit about how sort of the specific risk and safety factors in a family might help you make that decision in terms of deciding what's relevant if I'm going on a home visit and I'm seeing and hearing, dozens or hundreds of things?
Right. So certainly, again, like I said, with the example of the clothes, if one of the concerns was that this child is going outside in 20-degree weather with no shoes on, then what they're wearing when you go to their home, what they're wearing when they go to school, is going to be relevant. If that's not an issue at all, if your whole issue in the case is mom's substance abuse, then maybe you don't need to spend time describing what they're wearing every single time. So thinking about what are the issues and honing in on them, and I know that we want to do a global look, and so we want to do that at least once and make sure that we're covering those things, and make sure that we are looking at those things, but when we're doing our documentation, honing in on those things that have been identified as safety and risk issues for this family and addressing those each time. Does that help? Okay. All right, so if you have got your handouts in front of you, we want to take just a couple minutes and try a couple of these. How much time do we have, Mel? Okay, let's try one and see how we do. They are on page 2 and 3. Well, let's try page 2. There's some scenarios. Or some examples. Thank you. I'm a little slow here on the update. So if you look on page 2, there's some examples of how the first column gives you some examples of, you see these are very short. Joe's parents need to set firm limits. And then a more behavioral description is when Joe began throwing things at his sister, his parents tried yelling at him to stop, but he did not listen, which gives us a little bit clearer picture of what actually happened. There's several examples there. So on the next page, there's some that you can try. And I'm going to skip the house is filthy one because we have done that one to death. And I'm going to skip the intoxicated one. We've done that one quite a bit. Let's try this one because this is a hard one, I think. Mrs. Smith used appropriate discipline during the visit. So take a minute. If you're in a group, talk about it with your group. How might you describe that in a more specific way? Go ahead and use the chat box and type in your ideas for how you might describe that in a more specific behavioral video description.
Thank you, Holly. And we're just going to give folks a few minutes. As Holly said, if you're in a group, you can talk about it. We're not giving you a full case scenario, but right, that's excellent. Just imagine some examples of what might appropriate discipline look like or sound like. That's great, Cheryl. I love that idea. She talked in a calm manner to the child.
Yep, exactly, Marcy. Counted to 3, and when the behavior didn't stop. Right, just what you saw. And again, you see it takes a few more words, but somebody that comes behind you is going to know what she's actually tried. Wow, now they're coming in fast and furious if I can't keep up.
That's great. Well, and the other benefit, I think, Holly, to that is the types of things you're talking about. Those also help you know when they justify when you're ready to close a case. Right. And when a family has achieved their goals, when you're more specific and behavioral, that now the parent is using a timeout, asking the child to wait her turn. You're documenting the specific things the mother is doing, not only on the risk side, but on the progress side.
Absolutely. And it goes to that issue of we're looking for behavior change rather than compliance, which is another reason that whole issue of non-compliance is not a very helpful one, because it really isn't about compliance. Of course, our job is made easier if they will work with us, but it really isn't about them being compliant. It's about them changing their behaviors. So I think sometimes when we focus on compliance, we frustrate ourselves and we miss the boat. What we want to do is figure out how to engage them. And I actually had a brilliant participant in training last week that said, I think when we have families that aren't doing what we ask them to do, we need to look at ourselves first and ask ourselves, what haven't I done to motivate them to do what they need to do? And well, that sometimes, I know that can be frustrating for us because we feel like, well, they got to do something too, and we do have to take our part in that, because we have more power. The power differential is definitely on our side, so we have to kind of take that on. So absolutely, you guys are getting this pretty good. One of the things that I hear people say sometimes is that they want to write things like, Mrs. Smith used appropriate discipline as evidenced by, and then they write their description. And I don't mind that. That's perfectly fine. I just think it adds a couple more words, and I think you can just write, instead of as evidenced by, you can just write, Mrs. Smith, counted to 3, and when she still didn't do it, she sent her to the corner, or she sent her to timeout, or whatever she did. So just write what she saw, getting in what you need and making it as easy on you at the same time.
Right, and Holly, I thought it was really...
Social worker observed, thank you, yeah.
Yeah, the social worker observed. I like that. It's very, very specific, and when you go to court, that is really, really great when you can say the social worker observed the parent doing this. Very specific, so thank you for that.
Yep, yeah, and I like the spoke calmly, so you're describing not only what she did, but how she did it, and the specific descriptions of 4 minutes and 2 minutes. Nice job, folks.
And Debbie, in Pitt County, Mrs. Smith placed the child in timeout for 2 minutes when her 2-year-old son threw a ball and hit his younger sibling during the visit. That's just perfect documentation.
Mm-hmm. I love also Billy Moss and Gaston County talking about what have we done to model for parents, because I think it's great. A lot of our examples are around timeout, and sometimes parents struggle with what to do other than timeout. Even timeouts are challenging, and so I think that's where sometimes what might be documenting progress is documenting parents' attempts and what parents say to you about what they're trying. That sometimes I may be struggling as a parent, but I'm trying.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And making sure that we're documenting those conversations around talking to them about, especially with things like discipline, that when you start using an effective discipline, things are likely to get worse before they get better, because kids are they're not going to like a discipline that works, a discipline that holds them accountable, just like our families don't like being held accountable, which is sometimes, we have to remember that too, that when we start holding families accountable for things that they haven't previously been held accountable for, things get worse before they get better. That shouldn't be a surprise to us. That means things are working, and that's not noncompliance, that's human behavior. And so again, it goes back to that, not making those judgment calls, because they oftentimes are inaccurate. And like I said, that in that instance, that's not noncompliance. That's just human behavior when we're being held accountable, when most of us would rather run around willy-nilly doing exactly what we would like if we could. So absolutely. Do you have time for one more, or moving on?
I just want to mention, I love Regina's comment too about documenting when you give parents a tool or a resource. I think that's an excellent point, and it makes me think about, documenting reasonable efforts, that if you give a tool specifically on parenting, because that's one of the risk factors, that's a very strong, reasonable effort. So I love that point of saying, there's lots of things you do every day with parents in addition to observing them, and instead of just having a checklist of I did this, I did this, I did this, I did this, connecting it back to why you did this particular thing, why you gave them this particular tool or resource is really important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And interesting, I was this has been several years ago, I was in a county and reading records, and I was talking with the worker whose record I had just reviewed, and there were several things that I had listed that, policy kinds of things that she had missed. And as I was listing them, she was saying, oh, I did that. And clearly, I totally believe she'd done them, because she could give me all kinds of detail about them. And when we got done, I was feeling bad because I felt like I had kind of nailed her. And she said, you know what, I feel pretty good about this. I said, you do? And she said, yeah, because I'm doing all of that. My issue is just I need to document it, right? And I said, yeah. And she said, well, I can do that. So I was glad for that too, because like I said, clearly she was doing it. She just wasn't getting it down on paper. So again, I think it's just about making sure that you do give yourself credit and get down what you're doing, making sure policy can be a great tool. One of the things that I always talk to folks about is using the CSR tool. for a documentation, to help you with documentation, and I always say go in and look at those exploratory questions. Those will help you think about what needs to be in documentation, and they usually go along with you know, this exact kind of things. What kinds of services have you put in? Why did you put them in? How do they meet the needs of the family? Those are the kinds of things they're going to ask in court. What have you done to help this family? That's what the defense attorney is going to want to know. What did you do to help this family? So thinking about those things and getting this right for court is going to help you to have also help the family along.
Great, thank you so much. And I think it looks like excellent examples. And let me just ask, what was the form that was mentioned? Andy, do you mean a form that was mentioned by Richmond County or a form that was mentioned by the presenters? Oh, the CFSR form, can you say?
Oh, yeah, that's just the review tool that we've used in past CFSRs. That and I believe it's still on the Forms website. It's the Child and Family Services review tool. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong about that still being on the on the Forms website.
We can pull that form number and give that to you. We'll give that to you as soon as we have it. So thank you.
Thank you.
I don't see any other questions right now, so I'm going to pass the mic. Thank you, Holly. I'm going to pass the mic to Dee to talk a little bit about the agency's role in supporting good documentation.
Thank you very much, Millicent. I appreciate that. And hello to everyone. I'm just really happy and excited about doing this webinar on documentation. I think this is something that's been well received and well needed. One of the things that I also want to say is there's been some wonderful information coming through the chat area. Some of that feedback that you're using, we're going to make sure that we track that and make sure you have some of that for everyone to use, because I saw wonderful things in the chat area. The next thing we want to talk about is basically what management can do. And it's our agency's role. And the first thing I want to say is that we are a system of care agency. That's just who we are. And one of the biggest areas is accountability. And so to be accountable, then you know that it starts from the top, and that's management. So what management can do is basically set the tone. Now, how do we set the tone if you're a manager? And I know that you're on there right now. And so what I'd like for you to do as I go through this slide is think of some of the things that you can do as a manager to set the tone to make sure that you are supporting your worker. And so one is we want to emphasize quality and accountability. That's just who we are. We can't do this work without being accountable. And we are social workers, and we are involved in people's lives, and so what we do is quality work. We want to back it up by providing the ongoing support. And what that means is sometimes we have to just seriously make an investment in our social workers, because they are our assets, so that they can actually help the families, so that we can bring some permanency, safety to our children and child welfare and our families in North Carolina. Now, how do we make those investments in technology? Well, there are some things that we can actually get for our social workers to help them with documentation. There are some of those. We've listed some examples, and so sometimes you just have to make that investment. Go knock on the commissioner's doors and say that, you know what, we really need some extra money to make an investment in technology so that we can make very good sure that we are doing good documentation. And then, of course, we want you to know that the policy and practices that lead to current high-quality documentation, we really have to support that policy, and we have to make sure that we're doing the best practice that's going to do that. One of the things, and all of this is on pages 4 in your handout, so if you go to page 4, you can kind of follow along with me. So as we talk about this, one of the things that we want to consider is some of the strategies for workers and for supervisors. And if you'll go to page 4, some of the things that we hear is that social workers will say, my caseload is just too high, I don't have enough time to do this. I mean, I really want to provide good documentation, but it's a challenge. And so when we have workers saying that, then supervisors really, really want to support them. And so supervisors, if you will kind of look on page 4, there are some things that we can do. First of all, we want to make it a priority because documentation is that important. And some of the things that we can do and that we can consider is, well, how does this person work best? Everybody has a different style of how they work and how they get their documentation done. Mine was the way that I was able to do it is I had to do it now. I couldn't wait. My documentation was done as I went, and it was just great that way. Some people do it better in the mornings, but as a supervisor, you can kind of sort of help them figure out what their barriers are and then sort of plan ways to overcome them. So as you are looking through this, supervisors, if you have a great plan, remember people are tracking this. If you have a great plan for some things that you have done, please, please, please go ahead and put them into chat so that everybody else can see those things. And also, how long can this individual effectively work on documentation? Sometimes we have a caseload where things are popping off all the time, and is it that we can take 1 hour in the morning, 1 hour in the afternoon? You have to offer some flexibility in order to do that. And another thing is a lot of managers and supervisors, they have high expectations for their workers getting everything done. Make sure that the expectations are very clear, and whenever you come up with the plan for the worker, you don't want to just do the plan for the worker. We want that plan just as we do with families. We want those plans together because if you own the plan and it's done with you, it's so much easier to do it rather than to say, I want that documentation 7 days current. And so I like that protected dictation time for you, and a quiet day during the week is really, really great. I appreciate that. Supervisors, you have to follow up. If there is a plan that you have put into place for your workers to get that documentation completed, then you want to make sure that you're following up, and the follow-up will certainly ensure accountability. Also, sometimes we have to make sure, we don't want to just look in the record and just make sure, okay, there's a page in there, I see the documentation in there. You really want to follow that documentation to make sure that there is a clear story and that we're not just looking for compliance. The clear story means that, is this documentation tracking what's on the service agreement? Is this documentation tracking what the case came into DSS for? For example, if there are some safety and some risk, that documentation should follow the risk of the family. Also, one of the things that we have really, really heard is time management. I can tell you that every time I've been in the training room, and with 700 people on the line, I know that I've had a number of you in the training room, and when we talk about documentation, the first thing that people say is, I just can't find the time to manage it. So a lot of you are saying some things in the chat area, so I'm going to add some of the ones that's on pages 4 and 5. Regina, I like you when you say give me protective time, 2 hours every morning from 8 to 10. Oh, you're given that time. So Regina, whoever your supervisor is, tell her that she gets a high five from the team, because I think that is fabulous. And if you're doing that, you're going to make sure that you have some documentation. And supervisors, you do want to make sure that that documentation is in there if you're giving them 2 hours in the morning to get that done. So devoting some time to do that. If you will look on page 5, it says encourage them to work in a more isolated space within the agency. Sometimes that is a challenge. If you are in a situation or in an office where you are in cubicles, please give me a check mark, a green check. Go up there and just hit the agree button, and I will appreciate that. And for the ones that are in groups, that's fine. You can just do one check, because if you are in an area where you have a cubicle, it is more difficult for you to have that isolation in terms of getting your documentation done, because somebody will come in and they'll say, hi, you want to go get a cup of coffee, or, you know, let's go smoke. Some of those things do come up. So there are some things that we can think about that we can do when that becomes a problem. I certainly have been in an office before, but I've also been in a cubicle. So maybe there's an office somewhere that you can do that. Maybe you can put a sign on your cubicle to say, documenting, do not disturb. So those things seem to work. And if you could have someone take your phone calls, that would be wonderful. Because that will at least give you some time away from the phone. Also, guess what? What about providing your workers the opportunity to document off-site? Like allowing them time to go to a library, or even at home, saying, you know, you can stay at home from 8 to 10 to do your documentation. But you have to make sure that you are organized and that you're actually sitting down to do your documentation. Also, if you've got an unusually heavy workload, then offering some comp time or some overtime, which is wonderful to do. So that is absolutely great when that happens. So support is wonderful.
Dee, I just wanted to highlight some of the other great examples. I like that both, you know, agencies giving people time on Saturdays, having a dictation log, having protected time, but also I think it was Connie who said she likes to get caught up on days when she has backup intake. So I think it's a great example of there are things that the organization can do and needs to make decisions about, and then there are things that a supervisor and worker can figure out based on that individual person's schedule and style. So some great examples that I think really to reinforce that message that this is such a big task that we can't just lay it all on a frontline social worker. We need the supervisors and leadership to be supporting and thinking about this.
Yeah, and I wanted to add just one other thing, too. It just came to my mind, again, from last week in the training room, that, again, we had a participant that said she was fairly new. I think she's been in DSS for like 6 months, and she said she came into a DSS where the culture around documentation is it's impossible to be caught up, so we just won't try. And she's heard that loud and clear, and it's uncomfortable for her because it makes her stressed. So she was very anxious to say, what can I do to help everybody else? She said, I have a plan, because in other jobs that I've had, I've learned how to manage that, and what can I do to help others? So I just think that's something that we can think about, too, is what's the culture of our agency and what are we allowing to kind of be perpetuated?
Exactly. And also, I just want to give you some, just a couple of resources. One is in January 2007, the Jordan Institute for Families, they actually helped us direct a retention study, and one of the things that they found is that social workers do better and they stay longer when they get employee-focused, when they have employee-focused management, and when supervisors are supportive with things like documentation. So if you'll go to Practice Notes Volume 12, Number 1, January 2007, it's an excellent resource. You can read through that. It talks about what supervisors can do to hold on to workers and what workers can do to stay on board. And at the end of the day, we want to keep our workers and we want to support them. So that's good. And I want to give one more point that comes from our CFSR team about documentation. She said that supervisors should make sure that workers are documenting what really happened, what tells the story, no matter their narrative style or not, that it's not as important exactly how they document as long as the key information is there. So when the CFSR review is happening, you want to make sure that you're doing that. That don't just review the records and make a checklist, but make sure that there is a flowing story that relates back to the service agreement, the reason why we are involved, and then be able to give feedback on the documentation that you have been reviewing. So thank you so much. Also on page 5, I want you to look at the technology support that we're talking about, and I'm sure that you've got some of that, the drag and speak, the tablets, dictation services, the smart pens. all of those things are there. So thank you very much for the great job that you're doing, and I just do appreciate it so much. Next thing we want to talk about is when we are doing documentation, it's very, very important that we pay special attention to potential coercion when working with our families, especially when it comes to requesting drug screens or when it comes to asking about safety resources. You don't have to admit to this, but what I'd like to ask, is there anyone that has told a family that if you don't take this drug screen, it's going to be a positive one? Or if you don't take this drug screen, we're going to remove your children. So, these are things that you certainly cannot say. It is in, if you'd like to, go to Chapter 8, Section 1408. And under drug screens, it tells you it gives you some guidance as to how you are to ask for the drug screens. But if someone says that they're not taking one, you can't say, well, then it's a positive. And you cannot coerce them into doing that. Even with safety resources, you can't say, well, if you don't find a safety resource, we're just going to take your kids. So all of that also is in Chapter 8. So we want us to pay very, very special attention when it comes to that. Because when we're doing the drug screening, that needs to go in your documentation, and definitely we don't want you to do it because it's not best practice, but we definitely don't want you to put that in your documentation that I told them that if they don't take the drug screen, I will have their kids. So definitely not that. So if someone would just really quickly go to the chat area and tell me how you would document someone's drug screening. So if you were requesting a drug screen, how would you document that in your record, and how would you document the findings, and do the same thing with your safety resources? And we'll give you just a few minutes to do that. Laura, I see your, you said our judges tell clients if they don't go, then it would be counted as a positive. It's not best practice for us, and we certainly, unless that's part of the court order, we certainly don't need to put that in our documentation, and we certainly don't have to tell our families that. It's just against policy. So we're waiting to see what people are saying and actually how they document the drug screening, because that's very, very important to put that in your documentation. Social worker asked Ms. Jones if she would be willing to take a voluntary drug screen by 11 a.m. today. Okay. Requested a random drug screening, was asked to submit, and he declined to do so. He provided the reason as this. Very good. Parents say yes, but I will test good. Requested for the client today. Requested. Person denied. Social worker wrote reason for refusal. Good. Good, good.
Dee, while they're writing those, I just wanted to add, too, that actually the issue of requesting drug screens is not just against policy, but as far as our attorney generals are concerned, it's actually a violation of the Constitution, of the Fifth Amendment. So, so we want to remember that.
Thank you, Holly. Exactly. That's exactly what we have.
I hear Angie Stevenson in my ears.
and I love, Cassandra, the issue of it's more important to document how that drug use is affecting the child's safety. So I think that's a great point. We are not law enforcement, so we are not required to actually, prove this or that drug was ingested at this time about safety. So I love that comment. And I see Holly nodding very vigorously. Do you want to add anything to that, Holly?
No, I couldn't add anything more to that. That is key. I always say drug screens, I think we spend an awful lot of money on them and get very little in return for them. There's a million ways that people can fake them, and they tell us very little that's of use to us, because what we really need to know is how it affects the kids. I think they're more useful for telling us when people aren't using and when perhaps we can close the case. And again, I'm not saying saying we should never use them. I just think that maybe we've become a little bit too dependent on them. So yeah, we just need to be really careful about how we request them.
I totally agree with you, Holly, on that one, and I just also want to add that even if a person is using and they have put steps in place that rectifies the safety and the risk to the child, at the end of the day, that's actually what we're looking for. So we have to make very, very sure that we are documenting, and we're documenting the progress of the parent. I do know that there are parents that use, and if they're able to parent and provide a safe home for the child, then we're good.
Absolutely. And I just want to say, Dee, I'm going to ask you, I know there's a few more slides here. We'll move through them a little quickly because we're a little bit behind, but excellent examples. And I want to mention, too, one of the reasons we put this in the section on what agencies and supervisors can do is because these are kind of tricky situations. And so this really is another area where the recommendation is that agencies provide some specific support and guidance in consultation with their legal counsel about how these things should be talked about and how they should be documented. Dee, I'm going to pass it back to you if that works.
Okay. Hi, guys. So on the screen, I want you to look at the Orlando Centennial. It's a story from the Orlando Centennial. On a fairly regular basis, there have been scandals in other states in which child welfare workers are revealed to have falsified records. For example, to say that they have visited a child when in fact they have not. And this was a scandal that happened there, and you can certainly see when that was if you want to go ahead and read more about that. But we do not want to insult or accuse anybody of anything. We basically just want to encourage you that as a child welfare agency, we want to be scrupulously honest in our documentation. Failure to do so could seriously jeopardize our children's safety and well-being, and it also could result in firing. I know that when I was in the county, some of those things happened in my county, and you know, we used it as a learning tool. We have seen this in North Carolina and some other counties in recent years, criminal charges such as forgery or even obstruction of justice. So if you want to know where to go and get this article, it is at www.orlandocentennial.com, and
we can put the link in the chat for folks if they want to read more.
Yep. If you want to read more, we will put the link in the chat. And so if you will go on the next slide, talks about agency liability. Well, we're not liable for mistakes. I mean, sometimes we are going to make a mistake, but we are liable for lying, for falsifying records, and for not following policy. If you're following policy, if you're making sure that your documentation is accurate, that it's not falsified, then you're good.
So I think, again, Dee, one of the reasons that this is in this section is because, you know, knowing that policy and setting that culture of sort of accountability and integrity really is an agency leadership and supervisory issue, as well as being, you know, about what the individual workers do. And we know we have fabulous workers across the state, and sadly, when people often hear about child welfare, it's the mistakes that are made. But we know that, you know, there's good work happening every day, and so part of it is about protecting yourselves and your agency. Because you're doing so much every day to protect families. Is there anything you would add on that issue, Holly?
No, I think that don't falsify records. That's much worse than having missed something. I think we get very caught up in liability, and I think if we're doing the best we can and we're really working to try to keep kids safe, we're going to usually be safe from liability. Where we get really in dangerous territory is when we're not following law and policy. It's one of the places that we are most unprotected from liability. So, yeah.
Great, thank you all. So let me just have us pause to address a couple of questions. Well, one comment from Cassandra Putney is about, you know, is it possible that as workers we may need more training on professional ethics, because sometimes we may not know exactly, you know, what's the right course to take. Billy Moss in Gaston County recommends going to UNC Charlotte or one of the other schools of social work. They sometimes have trainings on ethics, and I know NASW North Carolina also has regular trainings on ethics, and I don't know if folks want to use their chat box if you have other recommendations for trainings around sort of legal and ethical issues for social workers, because sometimes it can be hard to know, and you can feel a little torn between, you know, what a supervisor or what a judge may be asking you to do and what feels like what might be the ethical thing to do. So, oh, thank you, John. Thank you, Dee. That's great. Dee, is that to the Code of Ethics?
Yeah, it's basically a document that that I researched before this training. It's actually a supervision document, and it's just to support supervisors in this documentation for workers. But it also has an ethics area as well, and it's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful tool, and it's by the NESW. So it's a great tool. So this is for all of the supervisors out there, but there's also in this document wonderful information for workers. It talks about what you can do to support workers, what workers can do, what management can do. So it's a great tool.
Thank you, Dee. And I also want to add this question: if a child is tested positive for substance abuse at birth, I'm sorry, I'm not able to read the full.
I just read that. I can actually respond to that. I just read that, Regina, and what Regina's saying is that if a child is tested positive at birth, then does that change anything in terms of the drug screening? And bottom line, not really, because what happens is when a child is tested, you know, and you can go on your county's policy as well as the state policy, but what happens when a child is tested positive at birth, then it is a report. We take it for a report. We take it for a report under neglect, because in North Carolina we do not have to where we can do it for abuse, because a fetus is not considered a child. And we take it for neglect under environment injurious, because we're not really sure what that environment is going to be like for that child. So we take it under environment injurious, and then we kind of sort of see what we need to see. If we do need to, as we go on, and when I say that, then and I'm going to give you an example, a real quick example. There was one where there was a child born with a positive toxicology. Father had no clue that mom was using. Parents had come down from Philadelphia, and they were there with the child. So all was well. But if we go into a situation and we go into the environment and we see that the power's off and all those things, in order for us to make sure that this person is ready, we may do need to see, okay, is she still using? Will she be able to pay her bills? And so we may be able to use it like that. But at the end of the day, it's still going on the safety and risk to the child. I hope that answered a question. So
I just wanted to add, too, that nothing changes about how we ask for it. We still can only request it. We still can't demand it.
Right. Yeah. Very good, Holly.
That's great. Thank you all so much, and thank you for the questions. And so Joanna is asking for the link and site name for that policy. So I will say we will send out a follow-up document to this webinar, a Q&A document, and we will include all of the links and resources that have been referred to. Go ahead.
I'm going to go ahead and add it, because I pulled it before the training.
Okay, that's great.
I'm going to go ahead and add it.
Dee will put it in the chat box, and we will also include your questions and resources and suggestions in a follow-up document.
And I'll just say, too, it's also in Deer County Director letter from 2003 that came out. And if anybody in your agency has had CPS assessments in the last 5 years, it's in the appendix of that training book also. That letter, we've had it in there for a long time.
That's great. And we can include that letter in the follow-up document as well. That's great. Thank you all so much. And please do keep your questions coming. We have a few more minutes. I'd like to at least try to do at least one of the case scenarios. And so, Holly, can I pass it to you to review that?
Okay, so you've got a picture there in front of you, and I want to also refer you to page 6 in your handouts. There's a little information there about the picture that you're looking at and the case there. So you're going to be looking at number 1, the one that says depression. So what we would like you to do is just read over that little bit of information there and look at that picture. Take a few minutes if you need to talk about it within your group, and then just tell us what words would you use to describe what you see upon arriving at this home on this day.
We know we're just going to have silence for a few minutes because we know it'll take a few minutes to read it over and talk, discuss, and chat your answers. So we're just going to give folks a chance to do that. But we are still here. So again, as you read that case scenario is on page 6 in your handout, the one on depression. If you would use that chat box, just describe what words would you use to describe the home and the family's behavior during the journey.
Right, Surrey County, we're going to assume that that you were able to lawfully enter the home.
Again, as you read, okay, these are great examples and suggestions. And I love the idea of checking in with a supervisor to not feel like you're on your own with this. So great description.
As well as checking in with the safety resources to bring about that mom's other supports.
Great, and I like Jackie also bringing in that it was while the 2 daughters were outside unsupervised, because that ties in not only the description of what you've seen, but also the connection to the risk to the children.
Right. And I like just the simplicity of social worker arrived and Mrs. Smith was lying on the couch sleeping while her 2 daughters were outside unsupervised or outside playing. It just says what's there. It doesn't say that she was drunk or that she was high, or it doesn't assume anything. It just says what you see, because there are many answers that it could be. So some of you have already talked about what would you do. Some of you said call your supervisor, call some of the safety resources. How might you, when you are doing your documentation, how might you explain some of those actions in terms of the child-specific risk factors or the case plan goals? And you've got some of those again on your handout on page 6. how might you talk about those in your documentation? Hmm. So I wonder about describing the steps taken to secure the safety of the children. What were those steps that were taken to secure the safety of the children?
I like the idea, Joyce, of reviewing the case plan goals and the mental health exam. I think, many times we may discuss things with families that we think are important, and at certain times there's a lot of, maybe denial or feeling, minimizing, and so there are those times where you visit the home, may not be as extreme as this example, but where you are seeing things that relate to what you're recommending, and that's a great time to say, I'm really concerned about your depression, and when I see you practically asleep on the couch and the girls outside, I'm really worried, and I'm wondering about the mental health evaluation. So to sort of use what you're seeing, not only in your documentation, but in your work with the family, to revisit why it is that certain things are being required by the courts.
Right. Right. And I love to see, too, that several of you saying reviewing the case plan. I love the idea that those case plans are a living document that you're using every time that you go out and talking to folks about what's in them. And talking about perhaps, we've had this service agreement, we've got some things in place. Are they working? Because here we are again. Did we miss something? Are we working on the wrong thing? Sometimes even when we've done a great job of engaging the family and having the family come up with a plan, sometimes even their plan, they thought it would work and it just turns out it doesn't, and we have to step back and go, what do we need to do differently? Do we need to add something? Do we need to tweak something? What do we need to do? So having those plans with you and talking about those, great. And I love that you guys are liking each other's stuff so that you steal from each other. We always say that.
And Holly, you're accurate about that. And that's what I really appreciate about training is I appreciate people coming in and sharing what's happening in their agencies and how well it's working. So, but we are tracking this for you so that we will be able to put this in a document for you.
Right.
And
another example of working with the family about getting help, who could I call to help supervise the kids? Another great example of it's an action that you're taking, but very directly related to a risk to the children.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was just going to also say that I am also including that letter for the drug screening. So it's right there. And this will be part of your information that we also track as well. But for anybody who just wants to look at it right now, there it is. Oh, you're welcome, Connie.
Holly,
good to see your name.
So, and I think, this is great. Of course, depending on the actual situation of really, consulting with folks in your agency to see, how do you ensure the safety of the kids in the least intrusive manner possible. And of course, sometimes that's hard to tell on the spot. So I love the idea of consulting with supervisors and other safety resources and mental health resources so that you have a plan that really makes sense. And in fact, someone mentioned the child and family team. I think it's a great example of something, right, that you could bring to a child and family team once the immediate safety issue is and supervision issue is addressed, to really make sure you've got a plan that feels good. And documenting the words. That's great. Holly, have you seen anything else that you want to comment on?
The only thing I would say is this is just the trainer and me coming out. I love Jolie talking with Miss Smith about how she came to be asleep on the couch. The only thing is I would be careful about asking the why question. Those why questions can sometimes set people up to be really defensive. She's probably aware that having the social worker come over and find her kids outside playing while she's asleep on the couch is not a great thing. So just talking to her about, how'd you get here today? How are you feeling? Tell me about how you got to be sleeping on the couch today, whatever, something like that. We might want to put some thought into how we ask that question. Those questions are our best tool, and sometimes how we ask them makes a big difference in how things go after that, and also how we document them. I think how we document things sometimes influences how we interact with our families. When we document things in a way that is respectful and non-judgmental, I think we make it more likely that we're going to interact that way with families. So just thinking that way all the time, even when we're not talking to families, but just writing that way makes a difference.
And also, I think that sometimes, though, asking about it, I do love the idea of asking about it. As Billy said, Billy Moss said, tell me what's been going on that you're sleeping on the couch, because that's also being non-judgmental, that we're not necessarily assuming that she's drunk or that she doesn't care or that, who knows, maybe the children were sick and she was up all night taking care of the children. Maybe she just got a new job and she's working the third shift. There could be lots of different reasons, and so I love the idea of not jumping to conclusions.
Maybe her medication was changed, and new medication sometimes has a different effect on us than we expect or than even the doctor expected. So absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah,
and I like what Connie said. Connie said if we stay calm and non-threatening, we're going to get a more honest response. It's kind of like if you spill the milk and you say, who spilled that milk? Why did somebody spill the milk? You go, oh, I didn't spill the milk. But if you ask what happened, there's spilled milk. I've noticed that there's milk spilled on the floor. What happened? Somebody should say, oh, well, I was running and I just spilled the milk. So it's really, really very important as to how we ask those questions.
And I love Dawn Maynor and our folks in Robeson County, that idea of once you get those basic answers, then also, again, going back to that case plan and service plan and risk factors, what can we do together to help ensure this doesn't happen again? And I think that's excellent, and it would be excellent in court documentation to show that you were trying to plan with the family actively to address these things. So great, open-ended questions.
Open-ended questions are always better.
Love it. I'm going to feel free to keep again, just one more time, we will capture these and share them so you can have them not only for future use, but for folks who are not able to join us today. Excellent examples and suggestions. So thank you all so much. We are actually going to skip the second case scenario because I think you've hit on a lot of the, covers a lot of the same ideas. Want to see, just looking again, if there are any. I don't believe that there are any outstanding questions, but maybe John, Adi, and Holly can help me if I've missed anything. Oh, okay, I see one. What is the state's policy when a child is, sorry, the questions are getting cut off a little bit. I think born to parents, I'm going to try to look for that one from Ms. Wells, born to parents while the other siblings are in the custody of the department. Let me see if John's going to, sorry. What is the state's policy on when a child is born to parents involved with the agency while the older siblings are in the custody of the department and in foster care?
Um, so I'm going to give the same answer that I give that makes people crazy all the time. That's a case-by-case decision. It depends. In some cases, the child may, there may be reason for the child to come into care, depending on why the older kids are in care. It's going to depend on the situation of that family. I can think of a case that I've been involved with where we had 4 kids in care, and it was 9 months before the new baby came into care because we didn't have any reason to remove them. I can think of other cases where we removed a child straight from the hospital because we had older kids in care. So it's going to depend on each case and what the situation is for those kids. Sometimes the situation was specific to the older kids that are in care, and maybe the situation is a little different for the new baby, like maybe there was some health issues that the parents couldn't deal with the kids that are in care, but the new baby's healthy and doesn't have those issues, and mom has some support and is doing fine or whatever. So it really is a case-by-case basis. There's no specific policy. Dee, would you add anything?
I will add to that. Thank you, Holly, and you're absolutely correct. It just really depends on the situation, because if it is an environment injurious situation where we feel like, oh my goodness, we just found out this person had a child and we just removed the children like 6 months ago, I honestly believe that it is in the best interest of this child's safety. And then, of course, we could do an environment injurious report. I don't think that it is always just an automatic report. There's nothing in policy that says that it's an automatic report, but I think it is an automatic eye-opener for us to just kind of assess it first. I think if it were turned around for Jolie, that it would be more family-centered, kind of assessing the situation, not just saying we're going to take this report, then we'll accept it, because we have to remember that we still have an obligation to policy and to law, and the obligation to law pretty much says that if it doesn't fit abuse, neglect, or dependency, we cannot just go knock on someone's door and say, let me see, let me check it out. So it definitely is situational where that is concerned, but if you feel that it's in the best interest and that you can make it an environment injurious and that will fit the legal definition for intake, by all means, accept that report.
Thank you all. And let me just get one. I want to just to pull this back to documentation. Another question is there, what about format? Is there a specific format for documentation that's considered better?
I don't think that there's one format that's considered better. I think that I think it's best if your agency decides on one, just for continuity's purpose. But I don't think that there's one format that's considered better than others that I'm aware of. And I don't know, Dee.
I'd just like to say that, when you talk about a certain format, and the reason why people come up with a format is just to make sure that they get everything in there. Like, for example, there's a format, you can look up online, it's called GIRP, G-I-R-P, and then and it talks about the goals, the interventions, the results, and then the plan. And then there's another one that we use in in-home services that I kind of just made it into an acronym, and it's called PAPER. So that one's in-home services. But I think at the end of the day, we have really tried to use our CMAPS acronym, and that's basically, what's socially going on with the family, what's environmentally going on with the family, economically, what about mental health issues, what are activities of daily living, and what's going on physically, and what are the family strengths. So we can use CMAPS. I think we're going to make sure that we cover everything.
Okay, let me see if there are, and again, we will put can put some information about those specific models in the follow-up document. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about transfer of learning. We know how critical this is. I want to mention that in your handouts, starting on page 7, is a wonderful transfer of learning action plan from Dee that I think really is a great tool, and especially for those of you online now where you have supervisors and workers together, we really offer that as a resource for you, not only for this event, but for just the general topic of transfer of learning for all of your staff development efforts. And yeah, as John said, that starts on page 7 actually in the handouts. But for right now, because our time is winding down, we want to just ask if you would use your chat pod. We'd like to ask you one thing that you personally will do to improve documentation in your agency within the next week, either personally or as a supervisor or a manager. If you would. And thank you, Jackie. Improving on being more descriptive in what I see as if watching a video. That's great. So I'm going to give you all a chance to do this. And yes, Nash County, we will give details about that papers and the CMAP and the GURP, the various documentation models that, that Dee mentioned. We will send that out to you. Great. Now to use the word appropriate, awesome. Love it being more descriptive. More behavioral, excellent.
Hey, as you go, David, exactly. I'm so glad you said that. David, I'm going to share this story really quickly. I'll make it really, really fast. But I was always behind on my documentation, and one day I was in Cracker Barrel, and there was this cassette tape. Yes, it's been that long. And there was this cassette tape said, you stop procrastinating and do it now. So I got it, I put it in my car, and I listened to it. And the lady had this really calm voice, and she was saying, just do it now. Do not move papers twice. When it happens, just do it now. And I started using that, and I share this with most of my classes, but I started using that procedure. When the phone would ring, David, I would pick up my pad and I would write. When I left the client's house, if I didn't feel comfortable with writing in there, or if I didn't want to make them feel uncomfortable, I would pull to the nearest service station or convenience store, and I would write my dictation. From that moment on, I was never, ever, ever behind on my dictation again once I started that procedure. If you can use that procedure, it's good, because I was behind all the time until I started using her Do It Now. So do it as you go, and you'll never be behind.
As folks finish writing, putting in their goals, which are fabulous, by the way.
Go David's unit. He said they always do that. That's wonderful. Tell a story with dictation, Shamika. Thank you.
I just wanted to add one more thing. Another tool, I know we've got some supervisors on the line that have been through the supervision training. Another tool similar to the TOL action plan that we've got here that you can learn is your learning plans that you learned about in supervision training to help folks work on their getting their documentation accurate and quality, and also on time. So that's another way that you can go to work on this.
Thank you all so much. Excellent examples and goals. Thank you all so much. And we really do appreciate how very busy you are. And you know, if this were easy, we wouldn't be having a webinar on it. So we really appreciate the ideas and the resources. So let me just cover a couple of things, because I want to make sure, number one, you know that you do have Dee and Holly's contact information in your handouts. Again, if you haven't gotten there yet, starting on page 11, I believe it is, starting on page 15 in the handouts, you have all of our slides, including this one with their contact information.
There is no E on the end of McNeill, though.
Oh, look at that. Sorry about that, Holly. Holly McNeely.
McNeely.